to be with the young people of the Northampton Diocese for your winter weekend together, or apart virtually, but you know what I mean. My name is Fran Walsh and I'm a lay chaplain in the Archdiocese of Birmingham. But for the first 18 years of my life, I lived in Northampton, born and bred. I lived in Kingsley as a small child. I went to St Gregory's Church. I then went to Thomas Becket Upper School, as it was called then. My parents moved when I was at university, so I don't often have the opportunity to go back. But I think that makes today very special for me because I'm speaking to people who I feel connected with. Even though I don't know any of you, I feel like we have a common sense of home. So at the beginning of your day together, I've been asked to help you reflect on the journey we have all been on for almost a year now, well, at least the last 10 months. Not to make you sad or depressed or frightened or worried, but sometimes if we take a moment to stop and reflect, that's when we truly understand the significance of something we've been in, understanding its value and unlocking its truth in our lives. So at the start of our time, let's stop. Let's look back. Let's reflect on where we are and where we've come from. So for the next little while, I'm going to be sharing with you some of my thoughts and some of my reflections on this last year, and stopping at various moments and asking you questions, giving you a moment to stop and to think, to help you reflect on your story and your journey. So if I were to tell February 2020's me what the next 12 months was going to be like, I don't think I would have believed myself. And I don't think any of us would either. Last February half term, I went to America, to Boston, a place I've been to many times. My husband meets up with his friends and sees his godson. And we had a wonderful time, sledging down snowy hills, having parties with American friends who had traveled across the country to come and see us, exploring new and exciting places, going to shopping in huge malls. I even had my first experience on a VR headset. It was such a carefree and happy time, full of laughter and hugs and new experiences. We had not a care in the world, or really any sense of what was about to happen when we returned back to England in the next little while. So my first question to you, how did you spend February half term 2020? Did you make the most of the opportunities? Were you appreciative of the freedom you had to live life to the full? We move on, and I remember early March. I started to get worried about the coronavirus as I learned how to sign it in my sign language class. I thought I'd show you. So we have this and we have this, like the crown on the coronavirus. So we've got coronavirus. So coronavirus. And I knew if we're learning this word in sign language and if a sign had been developed, then this must be something I need to take seriously. And by the 15th of March, I started to limit the people that I was seeing socially. It was my brother's birthday, and we only saw him very briefly outside. It seemed so sad that nobody did anything to celebrate. But of course, we were starting to think maybe we shouldn't gather together. I was meeting with people from church to start to think about how we could get our parish safe for Mass to continue. Talking about cordoning off rows and keeping people at distance and a one-way system and not using hymn books. But little did we know that all that work was just for one weekend. And by the end of the next week, our country was in its first lockdown. The schools were shut, and so were our churches. I'm sure if any of you were in year 11 last year, or if you have siblings or cousins or friends in year 11, you will have experienced the panic of that last week in school as you were sitting mock papers, trying to get all your coursework together, making sure that your teachers had all the evidence they needed for your GCSE grades. I was with year 11 that week, supporting them as the nerves and the fear were growing. And at the end of that week, as the last child left the school, I went into the chapel. I opened the tabernacle and I put Jesus safely in my rucksack. I walked the empty streets to the Franciscan community across the way to give them Jesus to look after. That was the strangest walk I've ever experienced. I was really aware of not getting too close to anybody I might meet, but also aware of the precious load I was carrying in my rucksack. And with our churches closed, I had no idea when I would next be as close to Jesus again. I took Jesus on a journey through the streets around my school for the last time in goodness knows how long. So it was a really significant moment, a scary moment, but significant, and will stay in my memory. If you think back to those early days, none of us had any idea what we were doing, how to engage with online school, how we would spend so much time with our families under one roof, how to manage the fears and uncertainties as we were experiencing this global pandemic for the first time in our lives. So for our second question and moment to stop, when you think back to those early days, what were your experiences? What were the moments of struggle and tension? Were there any unexpected moments of joy? What did you miss most? And what were you surprised that you could live quite easily without? We were in the middle of something huge, something unprecedented, and we had none of our usual support networks around us. We couldn't see our friends or our extended family, our parish family, our youth groups, or even that old lady who would sit at the end of the pew in church, who would always comment on how much we'd grown. These people were not in our lives. I'm sure there are a great many people that you have not seen yet since lockdown, since March. Maybe if you have the opportunity today, you might want to stop and think about them. Ask God to look after them. So we carried on. We had no idea when we would be able to go back to church, when we'd be able to go to Mass in person. Most churches got to grips really easily and quickly with Masses online. We saw lots of funny clips of priests forgetting to turn their cameras off and mishaps and funny picture overlays appearing on our parish priests' heads. It was really an interesting time for the church as it got to grips with new technology. Some of us, I'm sure most of us, if we're all honest, will now have experienced going to church in our pajamas, something I never thought I would ever do, or at least not apart from in my worst nightmares. It was interesting. I popped back to Northampton Cathedral on a Sunday, the first time I'd been back since the Chrism Mass of the year of my confirmation. Virtually, I met my dad there. We had the WhatsApp open and were talking throughout Mass. We offered each other the sign of peace through text. A lot of us would have had the opportunity to go wherever we wanted to church and at whatever time. I hope you had the opportunity to go and experience some different churches, even virtually. In my first lockdown, I became a daily Mass goer, something I've never been in my whole life, mostly because when I was younger, I didn't really think of it. And as I grew up, I became too busy. But in lockdown, I was able to find a Mass early enough that I could sit each morning, eat my breakfast, and go to Mass. So a question for you. How did this pandemic impact your faith? Have there been moments of it being shaken, where the presence of God felt far away or distant? Or have there been moments when you found that still small voice of calm, perhaps in an unusual place? Time moved on, and summer comes, and things seem to get a little bit easier. We got used to our restricted lives, our small view, the slow pace of life, where a busy day was putting out the bins and going for a walk around the park. But slowly, the numbers of sick people started to drop and things began to open up. We knew we weren't out of the woods yet, but suddenly we could start to go places, go to the shops, perhaps a holiday, to see friends and family in outside places. We could go for food, and most importantly, we could go back to church. So another question for you. As things began to open up, where did you go first? Who did you see? And what did you do? I remember walking back into my parish church for the first time. It looked so strange and different. Big notice boards with safety announcements and QR codes outside the front. Hand gel at the door, where holy water once was. Roped off areas, benches we could no longer sit in. Signs and arrows indicating a one-way system. COVID Mass was very different. And it was my job as a member of the parish council to stand up on those early masses and to show people how to receive Holy Communion while still wearing a mask, keeping themselves and our priests safe. It was quite the responsibility. My normal task in church was part of the welcome committee with a group of young people standing at the door. And now, of course, we were redundant as the stewards were there in their high-vis jackets with their clipboards, sign-in sheets, hand gel. It all became a very different experience. But we were given a new job. Each week I'd make a mass PowerPoint because we were no longer allowed mass books and hymn books. And the young people and I would set up the technology, click through the mass PowerPoint so that everybody could still join in. And although we couldn't sing, we could read along with our hymn words. I always found it a struggle to keep focused at the creed. We'd click along quite happily with my mouse clicker. We'd get to the creed and I'd forget. And suddenly what had been a loud volume of people reciting the prayers and the responses suddenly went quiet, and we knew that one of us had forgotten to click. Church becomes different. There's no two ways about it, and it's still different. But gradually, perhaps in time, we look forward to things getting back to normal. Now, you might have noticed that I'm quite a smiley person. I can't help it. I'm quite happy, and I like to express myself in my smile. But wearing a mask hides that smile, and I was really worried. How could I show friendship and joy to people around me at church if my biggest asset was covered up? Now, I was reliably informed that I still have smiley eyes, so people can still tell. But it's so hard to express your emotions, your feelings, your joy, your sorrow, when your mouths are covered up. So, another question for you. If you've been back to church, do you remember how it felt that first time? How are things different in your parish? What new traditions have begun? And how do you communicate with those people around you when facial expressions are now so hard to read? September approached and we started to get ready to go back to school. Now, we all know there's nothing fun about being stuck in your class bubbles, navigating one-way systems around the school, keeping your distance all the time, constant hand washing. We had to keep our community safe. And what had been such a normal, everyday experience the majority of our lives, suddenly we were having to think about every move we made, everything we said, how we navigated. Everyday normal things became such a challenge. But at least we were together. We could be back at school. We could see our friends. Christmas came. What a strange time. Some of us perhaps saw extended family. Other of us didn't. No singing of carols unless you were very safe and social distanced in your bubbles. It was a very different experience. And now look at where we are. We're back in lockdown number 3, and this time our schools are closed. And we're facing those challenges again, but this time it's cold weather. It's grey, dark mornings. It's just that bit harder because we don't know when it might end. We need to have valor. We need to have confidence, courage, resilience to get through this next little bit of the journey. It seems unknown to us when it might end. We do have, however, a new sense of hope. The vaccine is here. The older generations and healthcare professionals are receiving their vaccinations, and all in good time, it will be our turn. There is hope. And this time, of course, in our lockdown, our churches are not shut. This week, apart from a walk near by my house in the local countryside, church will be the only place I've been. I look forward to it and don't take it for granted, perhaps in the way I used to. Church is the place we can go. So pause for some questions. How are you feeling right now? What are the fears and frustrations? Where are you seeing signs of hope? Is this lockdown different to the one before? Now, in times like this, it's often helpful to look for wisdom and inspiration from elsewhere. It often gives us a sense of perspective and perhaps shows us a new way. May I introduce Julian? And here's a picture of her just here. I'll bring her a bit closer so you can have a look. A statue of her because absolutely when she was alive, there were no cameras, no electricity. Now you may have heard of Julian of Norwich, but if you haven't, let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a woman who had so much courage, so much faith, and had an experience that lasted a lifetime of lockdown. Julian, so probably not her real name, although we don't know what her real name might have been, was born in 1343 and dies in 1416 at the kind of age of 73-ish, we think, which is incredibly old for people at that time. When Julian was a little girl, she would have been growing up through the Black Death and the subsequent plagues that came as a result of that. She would have experienced hardship and loss. Her family would have had to have been in isolation for her to have survived. But at that time, there was no national lockdown. There was no vaccine on the horizon. Hope would have been very far from her as she was growing. We don't know much about her life, but historians have thought that she did get married and she did have children. But plagues continued to come, and it's suspected that Julian's husband and children were all killed in a subsequent plague. She again would have experienced loss and isolation. It must have been so difficult for her to maintain her faith, living at such a difficult time. So Julian was no exclusion to loss and isolation. She was grief-stricken, but her faith was so powerful, and she became something that's called an anchoress. Now, these were people who enclosed themselves in a small cell attached to a church, and she lived a life of contemplation, of prayer, only having contact with the world through a small grate on the side of her cell. People would walk past and speak to her, and she would offer them counsel. People would give her food and money for exchange of her prayers. And it was her responsibility to care for the souls of the people around her of Norwich. She was very loved by her community. It's said that Julian managed to find calm in the chaotic world through her cell. Probably her most favourite quote that is most spoken was something she heard God say to her. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Words that I've absolutely said to myself over this last year. They offered her comfort in a chaotic time, in grief, and perhaps they can do the same for us. God tells us that all shall be well. In our lockdown lives, we have the opportunity to slow down, to seek God's love, to pay attention to the small things that most of the time we're too busy to pay attention to. Julian's life, her whole life, was just this. She writes about her experiences becoming aware of the love of God through looking at small things and in small ways. She tells us one of her most profound experiences was looking at a hazelnut. I don't know if you've ever seen a hazelnut. It's fairly small, and sometimes if you ever search for a picture of Julian, she's pictured holding a hazelnut. This is what she said. And in this, he showed me a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut lying in the palm of my hand as it seemed, and it was round as any ball. I looked upon it with the eyes of my understanding and thought, what may this be? And it was answered generally thus, it is all that is made. I marvelled how it might last, for I thought it might suddenly have fallen to nothing for its littleness. And I was answered in my understanding, it lasts, and it ever shall, for God loves it. And so have all things their beginning by the love of God. Now, a woman who has lost so much, who has suffered and is grief-stricken, she has every reason in the world to be cross with God because of her experiences, but she has this profound realization of God's love through gazing upon this tiny hazelnut. So a question for you. Where can you see the love of God in the smallness of your lockdown life? Have you even looked? Do you take time to stop, to listen? Have you had, or are you open to having, hazelnut type moments? Despite the smallness of Julian's life, she's been called one of the greatest theologians of all time. And her writings were kept safe for many years until they were published long after her death. She wrote a book called Revelations of Divine Love. So, my dear friends, in these challenging moments that are here now and are coming in the future, it's my invitation to you to seek God's love. And certainly, as we hear in Julian's experiences, this could be quite profound in the smallness of your lockdown life. I hope you have a wonderful weekend together. I want to leave you with one last piece of advice from Julian. When we struggle to understand what God is doing through all of this, this might help you. So Julian tells us that God says to her, "See that I am God. See that I am in everything. See that I do everything. See that I have never stopped ordering my works, nor ever shall I, eternally. See that I lead everything on to the conclusion I ordained for it before the beginning of time, by the same power, wisdom, and love which I made it. How can anything be amiss?" It feels like a lot is amiss at the moment, but God loves us, has always loved us, and continues to love us. How can anything be amiss?